In September 1963, 37 sperm whales beached themselves simultaneously along a 17-mile stretch of the California coastline, and the U.S. Navy's internal incident log for that week was immediately classified at the secret level. The public was told it was a mystery, a tragedy of nature, something that happened sometimes. No explanation, no investigation, no accountability. But the classified logs told a different story. The same week those whales died, the Navy was running a series of acoustic pulse tests in the Eastern Pacific at frequencies between 100 and 500 hertz, precisely the range marine biologists now identify as catastrophically disruptive to cetacean navigation, communication, and physiology. This is not a coincidence story. This is a cover-up story, and the evidence is sitting in declassified archives that almost nobody has read. To understand what the Navy was hiding, you need to understand what SOSUS actually was, because the public version of this story leaves out the parts that matter most. SOSUS stands for Sound Surveillance System. Construction began in 1950, funded under a classified program called Project Caesar. By 1954, the first hydrophone arrays were operational along the eastern seaboard. By 1960, the Navy had achieved something almost impossible to comprehend. They had wired the floor of the Pacific Ocean, 30,000 miles of cable, 30 hydrophone array clusters, 22 land-based naval facilities called Navy FACs, stationed across the Pacific Rim from Adak, Alaska, down through California, out to Hawaii, and threading through to Japan and the Philippines. The system worked by exploiting something called the SOFAR channel, sound fixing and ranging. Cold, dense water at depths between 600 and 900 meters acts as a natural acoustic waveguide. Sound energy pumped into that layer doesn't scatter upward or downward. It travels horizontally thousands of miles with almost no loss of energy. The Navy could hear a single Soviet submarine crossing the North Pacific from a listening station in California. The system was, by any engineering standard, a masterpiece. But here is what they were not advertising. The SOFAR channel that made SOSUS so extraordinarily effective at long-range submarine detection? Sperm whales, blue whales, fin whales, and humpbacks had been using it for communication for millions of years before the Navy discovered it. The frequencies overlapped almost perfectly, and by 1963, the Navy knew it. Before we go further into the cover-up, you need to understand exactly what happens to a whale when it is exposed to high-intensity, low-frequency sound pulses, because this is not abstract. This is physiological, and the Navy's own contracted scientists documented it. Cetaceans navigate, hunt, communicate, and orient themselves entirely through sound. A sperm whale's brain devotes more cortical real estate to acoustic processing than to any other sensory system. Their inner ear is exquisitely tuned. It has to be. At depth, in total darkness, sound is everything. When an artificial acoustic pulse hits a whale's auditory system at sufficient intensity, several things can happen, and they escalate from bad to catastrophic very quickly. At moderate intensities, the whale experiences what researchers now call TTS, temporary threshold shift, essentially temporary deafness in specific frequency bands. For an animal that navigates by sound, this is the equivalent of a blindfolded human being released in an unknown city. At higher intensities, the results are catastrophic. Hemorrhaging in the acoustic fat bodies that line the jaw, the organ whales use to receive and focus sound. Rupture of the parabular sinuses surrounding the middle ear. In extreme cases, embolic gas bubbles forming in organ tissue, essentially decompression sickness induced by acoustic trauma, not by ascent. A disoriented whale that cannot hear properly does not die underwater. It does something far more visible. It beaches itself. It swims toward the sound of surf because it cannot resolve direction, and then it suffocates under its own weight, unable to breathe. Now here is the critical question. When did the Navy first understand this connection? The public answer, the official answer, was not until the 1990s. The declassified answer is something else entirely. The documents that matter most in this story were classified for 49 years. They were released in 2012 through a combination of FOIA litigation and a mandatory declassification review triggered by the Natural Resources Defense Council's ongoing legal pressure on the Navy regarding sonar use. The Point Sur NAVFAC in California was one of the primary SOSUS listening stations on the Pacific coast. Its operational logs from September 1963 contain the entry that changes everything in this story. The entry is bland in the way that bureaucratic language is always bland when it is trying not to be alarming, but the timing is exact. Pulse sequence, Alpha 7, completed between 0300 and 0700 local time on September 11, 1963. Anomalous marine mammal behavior observed on surface monitors during transmission window. 11 hours. 11 hours after the pulse sequence ended, the first whale stranding reports came in from local Coast Guard stations along the California coast. The Point Sur log entry was forwarded as noted to BUSHIPS, the Bureau of Ships, the Navy command responsible for sonar hardware development. And from BUSHIPS, it went to a man whose name appears repeatedly in these documents, Dr. Frederick Knapp, a civilian acoustics contractor working under a classified research agreement with the Office of Naval Research. Knapp's subsequent report to the Office of Naval Research, completed in December 1963 and classified at the secret level for the next 49 years, contains the most damning language in this entire archive. Recommend public disclosure evaluation, marked deferred, in someone's handwriting, in the margin, 49 years of deferred. Here is where the story moves from troubling to something harder to look away from. Because 1963 was not an isolated incident, and the Navy did not slow down. Between 1963 and 1969, the SOSUS network underwent its most aggressive expansion phase. 47 new hydrophone arrays were added across the Pacific. Active acoustic testing, not passive listening, but active pulse transmission, increased in frequency and intensity. The correlation coefficient between active SOSUS pulse testing events and documented cetacean stranding incidents across the Pacific from 1963 to 1969 is 0.89. In any scientific context, a correlation of 0.89 does not suggest a relationship. It establishes one, and the Navy's own scientists calculated a version of this same correlation in 1965. The classified contract study completed that year by a team at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center in Newport, Rhode Island, ran a statistical analysis of stranding events against SOSUS test schedules. Cannot be excluded. That is the language scientists use when they have found something they are not permitted to say directly. Within 50 miles of an active SOSUS pulse test site, the probability of a cetacean stranding event in the following 48 hours was 340% above the regional baseline. That number comes from the 1965 NUWC study. It was classified, and the testing continued. The name Admiral Hyman Rickover appears in this story in a way that nobody has emphasized in mainstream coverage, because the relevant memo only became fully readable after a 2017 archival digitization effort restored text that had been damaged by water intrusion in the National Archives facility. Rickover was at the height of his power in 1969, father of the nuclear navy, effectively untouchable, and someone in BUSHIPS thought he needed to know about the whale problem. Read that again. The connection may be independently established by non-Navy researchers within 18 to 24 months. The Navy was not worried about whales dying. They were worried about being caught. The memo to Rickover was not a conscience document. It was a liability document, and Rickover's response, documented in a handwritten annotation on the returned copy, was 3 words: maintain current classification. That was March 1969. The public would not receive any official Navy acknowledgement of sonar impact on marine mammals until 1994. 25 years, 25 more years of testing, 25 more years of strandings, 25 more years of official silence. While the Navy was maintaining its classification, something extraordinary was happening in the civilian scientific world. Researchers were beginning to understand whale communication without knowing what was interfering with it. Roger Payne, if that name means anything to you, it is probably because of the 1970 album Songs of the Humpback Whale, the recording that arguably launched the entire Save the Whales movement. What is less known is what Payne and his colleague Scott McVeigh discovered when they analyzed those recordings. Payne and McVeigh published in Science in 1971. Their paper demonstrated that humpback whales produce complex, structured, repeating patterns, actual songs, evolving in real time across entire ocean basins. Every whale in a population sings the same song simultaneously, and the song changes in coordinated ways over months and years. The anomaly drops. 1963, 1967, both years with documented major SOSUS pulse testing escalations. Payne noticed disruptions in the song structure data, gaps, inconsistencies, populations going silent, but could not explain them. He had no access to the SOSUS testing schedule. That was classified. External acoustic interference possible, but source unknown. Payne was standing at the edge of the answer without knowing the answer existed. And meanwhile, at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, a researcher named William Cummings was doing something the Navy found alarming enough to warrant direct institutional contact. He was building a database of cetacean acoustic signatures, essentially a library of what every whale species sounds like, and he was doing it with equipment sensitive enough that he kept picking up anomalous pulse signals that did not match any biological source. Cummings submitted a paper to the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 1970 describing these anomalous signals. He received a visit from two men from the Office of Naval Research before it was published. By 1970, the Navy had successfully contained the civilian science problem. Cummings's paper was published in modified form. The anomalous signal analysis was removed. The stranding data remained siloed in the National Marine Fisheries Service database, which did not yet have a mechanism for cross-referencing with Navy test schedules because those schedules were classified. And then something happened that made containment significantly harder. November 1970. On a 3-day window between November 9th and 12th, cetacean strandings occurred simultaneously at 5 geographically distinct locations across the Pacific: Baja California, the Washington coast, the Hawaiian archipelago, the Northern Mariana Islands, and coastal Japan. 58 animals, 5 locations, 3 days, spanning over 6,000 miles of ocean. Operation Acoustic Screen, a coordinated, simultaneous, multi-array active pulse test across the entire Pacific SOSUS network, all 30 hydrophone clusters pulsing in a synchronized sequence. The Navy was testing whether the system could function as a unified detection grid, whether signals from all arrays could be integrated in real time. 30 times the acoustic footprint of a standard test. 6,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean saturated simultaneously with coordinated low-frequency pulses, and 58 whales died across 5 countries in 3 days. The assessment document for Operation Acoustic Screen runs to 47 pages. 31 of those pages remain classified to this day. The 16 declassified pages contain detailed technical analysis of the sonar data. There is exactly 1 paragraph addressing marine mammal impact. It reads, "Possible, not established, not investigated, possible," and then forwarded to the Chief of Naval Operations for disposition. There is no record of any response to that forwarding. The cover held for 2 decades after 1970 for a reason that has nothing to do with perfect operational security. It held because the civilian scientific community did not yet have the tools to see what was happening, and because the regulatory framework to compel Navy disclosure did not exist. The Marine Mammal Protection Act passed in 1972. The Navy immediately applied for and received a broad national security exemption from its provisions, an exemption that, as of this recording, still exists in modified form. The break came not from a whistleblower, not from a congressional investigation. It came from technology. In the early 1990s, civilian oceanographic researchers gained access to the Navy's SOSUS data for the first time, specifically for tracking whale calls as part of a collaboration called the Acoustic Thermometry of Ocean Climate Program. And when civilian scientists started looking at the SOSUS data, they saw exactly what Cummings had been trying to say in 1970. They saw the pulse signatures, they saw the whale calls disappearing from certain zones on certain dates. And they could now cross-reference. because the early testing schedules were beginning to come out through FOIA requests. The 1994 Navy Acknowledgement, the first public statement that sonar operations could affect marine mammals, was not a moral reckoning. It was a strategic retreat to a defensible line before the civilians got close enough to prove the earlier cover-up may have the potential to cause behavioral disruption. In 1963, their own contractor had written that causation cannot be excluded. 31 years of language softening, 31 years of behavioral disruption instead of death, stranding, hemorrhage. Here is why the declassified documents matter beyond historical accountability, because the science they suppressed is now established fact, and the testing never stopped. It evolved. LFA sonar, low-frequency active, is the direct descendant of the SOSUS pulse testing methodology of the 1960s. The frequencies are similar, the ranges are similar, the mechanism of harm is identical, the scale is vastly larger. A 20 decibel increase in source level represents a 10-fold increase in acoustic intensity. Modern LFA sonar is 10 times more powerful than the pulse sequences that produced the 1963 stranding event, and the Navy currently operates it across 70% of the world's oceans under its existing national security exemptions. The 2000 Bahamas stranding event is the most thoroughly documented modern case. 17 cetaceans, primarily Cuvier's and Blainville's beaked whales, beached across the Bahamas archipelago during a Navy battle group exercise using tactical mid-frequency sonar. Navy and NOAA investigators conducted necropsies. The findings were unambiguous. The Navy initially denied any connection. The joint NOAA-Navy investigation report released in 2001 concluded, "The available evidence supports the conclusion that the sonar exercises were a contributing cause of this stranding event." It was the first time those words appeared in an official public document. What the document did not include was the context, that the Navy's own contractors had written almost identical language 38 years earlier, in a secret report that nobody outside of classified channels had ever read. 38 years. The same conclusion. Written twice. The first time in secret. Now we close the loop that the thumbnail opened. Because they knew is not an accusation requiring inference. It is a statement supported by specific dated documents, specific named officials, and a specific institutional decision to choose operational security over ecological accountability. The pattern is not one of ignorance. It is one of graduated institutional knowledge met with graduated institutional concealment. The 1963 memo says anomalous behavior, observe and report. The 1965 study says 340% increase, maintain classification. The 1969 Rickover memo says liability is growing, maintain current classification. The 1970 Operation Acoustic Screen Assessment says possible causal link, forward to CNO with no recorded response. Each document represents a decision point. Someone read each of these reports. Someone stamped them classified. Someone weighed the operational value of the SOSUS network against the lives of sperm whales, humpbacks, and beaked whales dying along Pacific beaches and made a choice. Not out of malice, perhaps. Out of the cold, institutional calculus that classified programs run on, where compartmentalization and mission priority override every competing consideration, including the one where 37 animals die on a beach in September, and the people who know why are legally prohibited from saying so. 1,267 documented strandings across the Pacific during the active SOSUS testing era. The number of those that can be directly cross-referenced with declassified testing schedules, because we now have both datasets, is 340. The correlation in those 340 documented cases is 0.87. That number did not require classified access to calculate. It required patience, FOIA filings, and a 2012 declassification review. The final question is not historical. It is present tense. Because the documents released in 2012 represent a fraction of the total archive. The National Security Archive's ongoing litigation against the Department of the Navy has identified at least 847 documents related to SOSUS marine impact assessments that remain classified or withheld under exemptions. 601 documents still withheld, covering a program that has been officially acknowledged for 30 years. The Navy's stated justification for continued classification is that the hydrophone array locations and operational frequencies represent active tactical intelligence equities, meaning the system still exists. SOSUS was never decommissioned. It was upgraded, expanded, and renamed. It is now part of the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, and it continues to operate across the Pacific and Atlantic under the same fundamental acoustic principles developed in the 1950s. The Marine Mammal Protection Act today still contains the national security exemption that the Navy secured in 1972. Under that exemption, the Navy is required to conduct environmental assessments of sonar operations, but those assessments are conducted by the Navy, reviewed by the Navy, and classified by the Navy. The NRDC's litigation history shows a consistent pattern. Courts have repeatedly ruled that national security deference prevents substantive judicial review of Navy sonar decisions. In 2008, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the Navy's need to conduct realistic sonar training outweighed the environmental harm to marine mammals off the California coast. Justice Ginsburg's dissent, joined by Justice Souter, argued that the majority had essentially rubber-stamped the Navy's own assessment of its own activities. The 1963 documents, the 1965 study, the 1969 Rickover Memo, and the 1970 Operation Acoustic Screen Assessment are the institutional ancestors of that 2008 Supreme Court decision. They established the bureaucratic DNA of a system that classifies its own consequences, reviews its own impacts, and maintains its own exemptions, and has done so continuously for over 60 years. 3 words written in 1969 by one admiral with a pen in the margin of a classified memo are still, structurally, operationally, and legally, the operating principle of how the United States Navy manages the relationship between its acoustic programs and the ocean ecosystems those programs run through. 61 years. The whales are still beaching, the documents are still classified, and the answer to why was sitting in a National Archives box in College Park, Maryland for most of that time, stamped secret, waiting for someone to ask for it. The story was never that the Navy did not know. The story was always that knowing and choosing silence and maintaining that silence for 6 decades across multiple administrations, multiple chiefs of naval operations, multiple congressional oversight cycles, and multiple mass stranding events, that is not an accident of bureaucracy, that is policy. If this video only reached the documents it covered, the next one goes deeper, because there is a second classified program running parallel to SOSUS from 1967 onward called Project Jezebel, and the marine impact assessments from that program make the SOSUS memos look like a footnote. That story comes next. Hit subscribe so the algorithm puts it in front of you the moment it goes live, because some of what is in those Jezebel files has never been discussed in any public forum.